So let's, I guess, talk about the suppression of the religious sense a little bit, the sexual revolution I talked about last time, but I think that relates to the book of Ecclesiastes a little bit because, you kind of, you suppress the religious sense and you kind of wind up with an Ecclesiastes moment. That's where the world is, and that's why the church is likened to a field hospital by Pope Francis, and I like that image of us giving battlefield medicine, pressure, and elevation to this broken, hurting wasteland of people who, when this religious sense is suppressed, the Song of Songs, in the spiritual journey or maturing process is short-circuited. What do you wind up with? Nihilism, despair, kind of an Ecclesiastes moment. And people, the rocket turned upside down, driving into the ground. And nothing down here under the sun's going to do it for us. People running after things that are nothingness, vanities, ultimately, and don't satisfy. So they're hurting, and they need us there, the church there, to help them. Because it's this vision of God that kind of restores hope. Even in the preacher here of Ecclesiastes, notice when you're reading it, when he starts talking about God, it's like restores his hope a little bit. There's kind of an upturn in chapter 3 and chapter 12. But that, I think, is the lesson here, that the light of faith is sweet. It's so sweet. Oh, it's like when I was having my conversion when I was like 20, 30 years ago. And I'll tell you, I know it in myself. Like I was living, in college, University of Delaware, and the party scene and everything. And I just noticed the dual attraction that many of the saints, like St. Ignatius of Loyola, describes these two standards. I think of them as two attractions. The flesh and the spirit of St. Paul, whatever you want to say. They both attract and draw us. One just seems to leave us empty and desolate with a hangover and just side effects. It doesn't do it for us and leaves a bad taste in the mouth. There's nothing there. It's like cotton candy, vanity, emptiness, vanus. And it just vanishes after you eat it, and you have a hole in your stomach. And you feel nauseous. That is what I experienced. But yet when I went to church, when I came to Mass, I never left the church or anything, but when I came to Mass, it just felt so good. I'd sit there and just be like, oh my gosh, light, hope, peace, goodness, radiating from God, from the altar. Oh my gosh, it was like real food. My soul was eating real food, and it just felt so good. It hit the spot. There's a spot in all of us that needs to be hit. And when we suppress the religious sense, we're short-circuiting. People don't know about this. They don't hit that spot. And they end up, just spiritually sick and suffocating inside themselves and spiritually malnourished. And that's the state of our world. So the rediscovery of the spiritual sense, I think, is key. So, Rota Fortune, I'm not going to talk about that. I want to mention Isaiah 28 because I just love the image in Isaiah 28 of the bed that's too short to stretch oneself out on. The cover's too narrow to wrap oneself up in. There's so much. Isaiah chapter 28 is packed with wisdom, the bed's too short to stretch oneself on, the covering too narrow to wrap oneself up in. We're never going to get comfortable down here. Adversity and prosperity. Ecclesiastes talks about that. We experience adversity, and that's terrible. And then we experience prosperity, and we're afraid of adversity. We experience adversity, and all we long for is prosperity. And then we get prosperity, and we're afraid of adversity. It's just like back and forth. It's a story of our lives down here, this futile existence. In the day of prosperity, be joyful, and in the day of adversity, consider that you could lose this. There's this. So that pole of there's two poles of our daily life: adversity, prosperity. Adversity, prosperity. St. Augustine talks about that. He says, yeah, we never get really comfortable down here. We can't really get comfortable. So our hearts are restless until they rest in thee, St. Augustine would say. Now, ultimately, the answer we're searching for is not a philosophy, but a person. I already said that. And that person, this is the beauty of Christmas here. We have a little baby in that manger that looks like all the other babies. But it's what that baby signifies: hope, salvation, eternal life being offered to us, divine sonship being offered to us, our heavenly bridegroom in that manger, a chance to share the inner life of the Blessed Trinity. It's just incredible what Christmas means. In our darkness, here's this star over that manger, that little baby, and what that baby means. It looks like every other human baby. To borrow an analogy of this great theologian of the 20th century, Yaroslav Pelikan, he used this image of like a river, as kind of signifies time and the passage of time. And we're all like little whitecaps that rise up on the river as it's churning along. And all the whitecaps look the same. They kind of rise up and then they subside, rise up, subside. It's the whole field of whitecaps. But there's one whitecap, looks like all the others. That is the whole river. That is the banks of the river, the bottom, the banks. It's the sky. It's everything. Like one, it rose up just like all the others and subsided, but it was different because it was everything. The Son of God, the divine Logos, the Word of God came down here and looked just like the rest of us. So I love that image and the hope that Christmas brings. That God entered in to this endless cyclical existence that we're all in, this round and round, one thing after another. God came down into it and everything has changed since then. So to hear the gospel again feels so good after you've had your Ecclesiastes thought experiment, Ecclesiastes moment. I want to just run through Ecclesiastes and look at a couple things and see if there's anything interesting that I missed. I like this, how he has put eternity into man's mind. This is chapter 3, verse 11. He has put eternity into man's mind, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. That's just interesting to me, that expression. He's put eternity or infinity or whatever you want to say. There's a little spark of the divine in all of us in a certain sense, not to sound new agey or something, but there's infinity. We're made in the image and likeness of God. There's this kind of immensity in a certain sense to every single one of us. Any single one of us is greater than the entire physical universe in nobility, the greatness of our being, the dignity and nobility of our being is superior than the whole physical universe. All the animals, plants, the whole thing, man, all the planets and stars and the whole shooting match, all of it. We are greater than all of that, the human heart, because of the type of being we are. Made in the image and likeness of God, with the breath of God in us. This soul that we have elevates us to a status in the universe that is unimaginable, this dignity and nobility, to be this type of being, to have an immaterial part of us that is not part of the physical universe. We're immaterial. We have a soul that's generating consciousness that is received by our brain. It is not generated by the brain, but received by the brain. This immateriality, spiritual faculty enables us to bend back and perceive our own existence, to become self-aware, to become awake and self-conscious, self-directed. That requires a spiritual being. We're not just smart monkeys. We have something monkeys don't have. I talk to my cat all the time. Talk to animals, I'm telling you, they don't have it. We have it the moment we're conceived, and as soon as you start talking to a baby, they start learning, and soon they begin to speak in grammatical sentences. You can teach a monkey to, learn maybe 100 or so signs for like one word. They can't make sentences because they can't think abstractly. Okay? This ability to think abstractly and conceptually in the way that we do, that we're self-aware. Not only are we aware, but we know that we're aware. We know that we're aware that we're aware. There's a certain just infinity, immensity, eternity that's in our mind that God put there. How can matter attain that on its own? It requires something immaterial. Cannot be explained. Consciousness cannot be explained materially. You can make a computer simulate this, but how can a computer become artificially intelligent and gain this type of consciousness? We can mimic it, but we are so awesome. Wonder, deep amazement and wonder at the type of being that we are. To be a personal being is an amazing thing. It's the greatest distinction, metaphysical distinction you can make between beings. Next to divine and non-divine, the next greatest distinction is person versus non-person. That is such a huge metaphysical leap to go from non-person to person, that it's just awesome. Yes, just that God will judge in the place of justice. There's injustice. In the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. That makes us feel a little better. I mean, I don't know if it makes us feel better, but at least, we hear him say that, and we acknowledge that we love our great country, but it's just soiled with corruption. We were talking before, I was talking today earlier with somebody who used to work at the Capitol building. I was visiting somebody in the hospital. And one of their in-laws was in there who spent his whole career working in the Capitol building. And he was talking about the amazing amount of corruption that goes on in politics. After working his whole career in the Capitol building, just, anyway, in our church, just, corruption. So even there, in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness, Solomon says. And it just saddens him. But then he says in his heart, what restores his confidence, his hope? God will judge. God will judge the righteous and the wicked. For he has appointed a time for every matter and for every work. He's going to straighten this mess out. So young people, be careful, pay attention, and remember you're going to be judged at the end of your life. And all of us. I said in my heart with regard to the sons of men that God is testing them. This whole thing is a test. There's a movie called The Devil's Advocate that I don't recommend. But it's about Keanu Reeves, and he's a lawyer, and he gets tempted by Al Pacino and to go down the wrong path. He's trying to corrupt him and so on. He's the devil. Basically the devil's advocate. Okay, so Keanu Reeves is hired to be a lawyer for the devil, hence the devil's advocate. Okay, and so eventually his wife, she realizes what's going on before Keanu Reeves does, this trap that they're falling into, and she starts to see and understand. And she says, it's all a test. We are being tested. This is a test. And she's out of her mind. She's just she sees the whole thing for what it is, a test. And but Keanu Reeves doesn't see it. This life is a test. And thinking that way and seeing, it starts to put the pieces of the puzzle together of what we're doing down here, and it's no longer a sick joke. There's meaning and purpose. We're being tested, a period of testing, and there's going to be judgment at the end of it. So these are good and helpful things to reflect on that come up here in the Ecclesiastes, who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes down to the earth? So I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should enjoy his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? It's kind of agnostic, about the afterlife. Who knows? It's agnosticism, away from knowledge. The alpha privative tacked on to gnosis, agnosis, away from knowledge, the opposite of knowledge, the negation of knowledge. To say, I don't know, is to be an agnostic. And that's what he says here. Who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes downward? I don't know. I don't know what happens, He says that at one point, and I think, that's what we're left with, when we set aside our faith. We're kind of left with this. We don't know anymore. That's why God saw fit to reveal things to us. Otherwise, we wind up having some shadowy, weak notion of the afterlife like the Jews did. But, let's compare them to the Greeks. You go down to Hades and, they can't think anymore. They're just kind of dumb. The souls come up, and you have to pour some blood in a ditch or something, and they have to have human blood so they can think, because they just kind of murmur and babble like they're just going to, and then they get some blood, they drink some blood, and then they can start reasoning, again, and thinking and speaking to you. I have to serve them up, dish them up some blood. Now, and no one remembers them. They're in this land of shadows. That's an Ecclesiastes moment here. That's kind of where he's taking us, this shadowy notion of Sheol or Hades. It's just we don't know where we're going. So there's just kind of, it's kind of a pre-revelation stage here that we ought to try that on for size and see what that feels like and re-embrace our knowledge of the resurrection now that we share as Christians. Anything else? As he came forth from his mother's womb, he shall go again, naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil. There's no U-Hauls behind hearses. Eat, drink. I made that second part up. He doesn't say that. Eat, drink, and find enjoyment, or eat, drink, and be merry. Because our days are few. This is the gift of God, though, he says. I like that. Now, all the toil of man is for his mouth, yet his appetite is not satisfied. That's a good word for us after the holiday feasting. Where we just oh my gosh, I don't want to see another piece of pie for a long time. No, but we just eat, and we're never ultimately satisfied by that. I think this is an interesting distinction in chapter 6. Where he says that sorrow is better than laughter. You're like, what? Hold on now. But there is something, we don't want to be morose. That's not Christian. Joy is something deep, though. It's deeper than just frivolity, some kind of superficial frivolity is what he's contrasting real joy with. And that these two things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, mourning and joy. I'm like, ouch, that's powerful. You can have sadness, or grief in your heart, which is often in this life mixed and mingled with love to be virtually indistinguishable. Mourning, grieving, grief and love are kind of mixed. So, better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. Sorrow is better than laughter. Listen to this paradox. For by sadness of countenance, the heart is made glad. Wow. That is so interesting, folks. I'm not going to puzzle that out right now, but I like that. In Lent, we have Laetare Sunday. In Advent, we have Gaudete Sunday. They both mean rejoice. It's kind of hortative, subjunctive. It's like an exhortation to rejoice. Plural. Everybody, rejoice. not like a command, but like an invitation, an exhortation to rejoice. And there's two different words used for joy in Latin in these two cases. You got gaudire and laetare, and gaudire is inward joy, not necessarily outwardly expressed. Laetare is kind of outward manifestation of joy, and they're both good. But I think what he's talking about here is this deep inward joy that we can have, even though we may not be walking around, all jubilant and expressive of that joy. We can still feel tremendous joy in our life, even in the midst of mourning and grief, of this life. We have joy within us. That is a powerful word for us. So just because we're not walking around with a smiley face all the time or whatever, but we should obviously, being morose just dries up the bones. That's not being a Christian, being a sad sack. That's not what he's saying here. We need to balance what he's saying here with other great texts that we could connect to it elsewhere in the wisdom literature and in the scriptures to complete this picture. So I think safe to say I think we get the distinction, but that's where I think he's coming from there now. Anything else? Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Hopefully that's consoling to us all. In sin my mother conceived me. In sin my mother conceived me. Presumably David, speaking in Psalm 51, says that very thing, that in sin my mother conceived me. Original sin. That we have the effects of original sin residing in us, concupiscence. In sin did my mother conceive me. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity. Everybody sins. Proverbs 24 says, a righteous man falls 7 times, a day and rises again. 1 John says, anybody says that you aren't a sinner, they're lying. Okay? Spirit of God is not in them. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us if we say we have no sin. So anyway, 7 times a day we're conceived in sin, and that's exactly what Ecclesiastes says here. The sons of men, the heart of the sons of men is fully set to do evil. We're just inclined. That's what concupiscence is, an inclination towards sin. Woe is me, Romans 7, I do not do the things that I want. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. I know that nothing good dwells within me, but then he makes a key distinction, that is, within my flesh. Okay, that's the sin nature in all of us. But I delight in the law of God in my inmost self. I like that distinction in Paul there. So our true self loves God and delights in his law. But we do have this madness, this folly, madness on the brain, the hearts of men. It says this in chapter 9 too. In chapter 9 Ecclesiastes, the hearts of men are full of evil and madness is in their hearts. Anything else here? I like this here. He says, first of all, he says, behold, this is what I found, says the preacher, adding one thing to another to find the sum, which my mind has sought repeatedly, but I have not found. Now, adding things. I guess what I'm getting from that, adding one thing to another, is when I was a kid, I would lay there in the yard and try to imagine infinity, like a number line going up into the sky. And I would go faster and faster and faster and picking up speed. Like 1 million, 100 million, 500 trillion, 600 gazillion, babillion, zillion, jillion. And then I was trying to get to infinity and I couldn't get there, It's like you just bounce off like an invisible force field. And it was kind of tickled my brain. tickled something, and I would sit there and enjoy this effort to try to get my mind around infinity, because I knew it was outside of my grasp, but it was fun to try. So I don't know, who's the guy that flew up, and tried to fly to the sun or whatever with the wings? What's his name? Icarus? Icarus. Yeah, it was kind of like an Icarus experience, Try. So I that's what I get from this. And now he talks about women, ladies, sorry, but he says, I have not found among 1,000. Anyway, something about how he hasn't found a woman amongst 1,000 women. Of course, we all know he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. That adds up to 1,000. We can add that sum. And he just found no satisfaction. I like this here in chapter 10. Dead flies make the perfumer's oil or ointment give off an evil odor. So a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. It's like that image. It's like so many things. They're good. There's wisdom in certain things. Like, for instance, I like movies and stuff. And I'm always try to find something redemptive and good in movies in Hollywood. So I enjoy just the spectacle and just the whole experience of this narrative journey with these characters and experiencing it and entering into this. And story is fun, but you get a little foolishness in there, and it spoils the whole thing. It's like dead flies in the ointment. There's a fly in the ointment, and it stinks, and it stinks up the whole thing. It's like, here's a great movie. It's like a nice pan of brownies before you, steaming hot brownies. It's like looking at that. Oh, looks so good, smells so good, appetizing, but then you find out somebody put a teaspoon of excrement in the batter. Anyone want a brownie? Okay. You won't even taste it. Trust me, you won't even taste it, yeah? I don't need to taste. I know it's in there. I ain't eating it. All right, it's just, I like that because it's like you have something so good and they mess it up with something in there that they have to inject into something that's totally unnecessary to the plot, and it's like dead flies in the ointment. Just destroying makes it stink and give off an evil odor. That's what I was thinking of when I like this statement. If the iron is blunt, one does not whet the edge. He must put forth more strength, but wisdom helps one to succeed. I like that, cutting with a sharp knife when we live our lives with wisdom, godly wisdom, versus sawing with a dull knife. Nothing more dangerous than a dull knife. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of free men and your princes feast at the proper time, because it's woeful if your king is a child and your princes feast in the morning. That's a woeful state of affairs when you have a baby as your king seated on the throne, and all his princes are feasting in the morning, partying in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of free men and your princes feast at the proper time. I like this. For strength and not for drunkenness. Strength and not for drunkenness. But bread is made for laughter and wine gladdens life. I like the balance here, okay? But we do it for strength, When they're ordered properly, these things are good and helpful for us. They are from God, given to us by God. This sounds like Psalm 139. You do not know how the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child, so you do not know the work of God who makes everything. There's a certain apophaticism here, kind of like we don't know. We don't know. Away from affirmation is kind of what apophatic means, but For thou didst form my inward parts. Thou didst knit me together in my mother's womb. We've all heard that before in Psalm 139. Sounds a lot like this. You do not know how the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb of a woman with child. And that's exactly what I was preaching on this weekend, actually, in that section of the Catechism on the responsibility of parents to their children in the Catechism. And where it says, they have to recognize these are human persons and these are literally children of God, that they did not give them their spirit. Okay, they procreated their children. They didn't create them in the sense that God creates. God gave them their creative, generative power in the first place. So they're really procreators. And they do not create the soul. God does specially. And infuses it into that zygote the moment it's conceived. And a unique, unrepeatable human being comes into existence with its own unique genetic code. Okay, a unique, unrepeatable, incommunicable human person comes to be that can fit on the head of a pin. God infuses a specially created soul into that being. Parents do not create the spirit or the soul. God infuses it. You do not know how the Spirit comes to the bones in the womb. We don't know. Parents don't do that. That's kind of neat to just see that and realize that. God will bring every deed. This is how the thing ends, and this is a good way to end this whole thing. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep His commandments. That's a running theme through the whole thing. The fear of God, respect, reverence, owed towards God, keeping of His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. And then look how it ends, verse 14, 12:14. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Judgment is going to resolve a lot of the difficulties we have down here in our frustration with the existence of evils, real or perceived. So next week, the book of wisdom.